Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it's Chris in the Newscast studio.
And we're joined by Jane Corbin, who's in the middle of making a panorama about what's been happening in Iran. How's that going?
Yeah, we'll get there. We'll get there. Thank you, Adam.
And we were recording an episode of Newscast, the podcast, earlier on today, and you just come from interviewing a couple in Dubai. And in the middle of the interview, there was an attack.
Well, there were the alarms, the sirens, and I think both Abu Dhabi and Dubai had more missiles and drones incoming. And they were obviously really upset and quite panicky. They were trying to get to the airport, actually, because they thought they're getting a flight out tonight. We'll see, though. See if they manage to leave in the next few hours.
And also here's Chief International Correspondent Lyse Doucet. Hello, Lyse.
Hello. And of course, I have to say that Jane has a stellar history of always making it to her deadline on time, even feeding in documentaries live, right? Do you remember people used to do that before?
Yeah, A and B rolls. So
Yes.
you're feeding the A roll while you're editing the B roll.
This is when we did things on tapes.
I know.
Yes.
As opposed to just uploading things.
Don't show my age, Lyse.
Yes.
Please.
Right, we're going to focus this episode on events in the Middle East, the US and Israeli attacks on Iran and Iran's retaliation against its neighbours. And what we thought we would do is we would ask Newscast listeners to send in questions because our listeners have a habit of hitting the nail on the head and helping us all understand what is going on. So I'm going to go through the questions and then together we'll sort of brainstorm the answers. And it's not like an exam. There's no correct answer, as I've discovered this week, for lots of these issues. So our first question is from Chris in Waterlooville. He says, or she says, do you think Trump has underestimated Iran's wide-scale response? And then Chris has gone for a bonus second question saying, what does victory then look and feel like? So who wants to take that one? Lyse?
It's not even clear whether if President Trump was sitting here, whether he could give you an answer, because his answer has changed, sometimes even from day to day. If we take what should be the most authoritative account, which was the nearly 8-minute video he put out in the middle of the night in Florida time, the attacks had already started. Israel started the attacks in the early hours of Saturday morning, and he said, Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Iran cannot have ballistic missiles. The Iranian armed forces should lay down their arms. And when the bombing is done, the Iranian people should take control of their institutions. So, in other words, regime change. But since then, sometimes he talked about Venezuela being the perfect scenario. In other words, you go in with military action, you remove the president, in this case, the supreme leader, who was Ayatollah Khamenei, who was assassinated on Saturday, and then you work with a new person. Sometimes he talks about how many leaders have been killed, and he says, and it's a rather crass thing to say, but he keeps saying, well, the people we had in mind are already dead. And then he says the next day, well, everyone's dead that we were thinking of. And then today, just before we started recording, he said that he wants to help choose the next leader.
Involved, yeah.
So it's not clear, and maybe Jane can say it, it's not clear whether he would be happy with a change in the regime in Iran or it has to be regime change. And it doesn't help that senior members of administration give differing views on why the war started and when it will end.
Well, because Jane, we've had quite a few conversations in the studio this week about, well, did the Israelis go first and the Americans had to follow them, or did the Americans and Israelis jump together? And there's differing accounts of that.
Yeah, and as Lyse said, members of President Trump's administration have said, first of all, rather astoundingly, we were bounced into it by the Israelis because we knew that they were going to hit Iran and Iran would hit us back, us America, so we had to hit them. And then we've heard them quite the opposite. So it's really been all over the place. But I think the talk of regime change has really dialed down in the last few days. Although, as Lyse says, tonight or today, President Trump has indicated that he wants control over who comes next. And he's been quite firm. It should not be the son of Ayatollah Khamenei. So he's really put his spoke back in again. But less about regime change. And I think that's because the Americans realise that the people of Iran are not going to rise up and take to the streets with the risk of terrible bloodshed. That's not going to happen. So therefore, regime change is not perhaps going to be the simple thing that it was that we heard right at the beginning of these attacks.
And also, at least there isn't some new leader
Delcy Rodriguez.
ready to go like
Yes, there's no
in
Delcy
Venezuela.
Rodriguez who went from vice president to president, and suddenly they seem to have decided it's better to to work with the United States administration about cooperating with them on oil, on other things. The political system that you have in Venezuela is left-wing Chavismo after Hugo Chavez. But what you have in Iran is something completely different. To give you just a very short explanation, it's not as if you can simply take, as they did in Venezuela, with a certain amount of difficulty, because there are those in the administration and in the military who are deeply ideologically opposed to the United States. But the Iranian regime, it's not as if you can take one person and say, who could possibly be more pragmatic, could be among the reformist camp rather than the hardliner principalist camp, as they say. But that person would not simply change the system. He has to work within a system which is layers and layers and layers, political, ideological, religious, security, and the elite Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Basichi volunteer militia, ideologically hardline, deeply suspicious of the United States.
And Jane, what about the first half of Chris's question, which is, do you think Trump has underestimated Iran's wide-scale response? Because I'm thinking back to the military action by the US against Iran last summer, where, Iran fired back, but in a very limited
delayed
way.
as well in firing back. It wasn't immediate. But this time they fired back immediately, and in ever widening circles. I think 10 countries now have come under attack. And as far away as Azerbaijan, even at one stage we were told a missile was heading for Turkey, who is a NATO member. So it's a much wider circle and far more attacks. So I think that although Iran made it very clear before this started that if there was action, as last June, they would hit back at American bases, I think the scale, the number of attacks and the longevity of them has really surprised the Americans, and it's certainly surprised the Gulf leaders as well.
And I should just mention, this whole conflagration underlines not just the deep distrust between the two sides, but the deep misunderstandings that has been part of this relationship ever since, of course, the Islamic Revolution of 1979, that Steve Witkoff, President Trump envoy, says President Trump is surprised that the Iranians haven't given in after they saw the buildup of U.S. military might, the biggest buildup in decades, to which then Iran's foreign minister posted on social media platform X. He put an Iranian flag and said, "We are Iranian." In other words, you misunderstand the nationalism of the people of Iran and their defiance and readiness to fight back.
And also Iran's neighbours, how prepared were they for this? Because the threat has been there, but it also seems like they've been quite surprised that the threat then materialised.
They didn't expect it. I was really struck by what happened in Kuwait, where 4 reservists in the US military were killed. They were in a sort of almost like not a caravan, but they weren't even under hardened shelter. They were IT specialists. They were working in a trailer, and they were hit and killed in Kuwait. And you sort of feel, well, wasn't there any recognition that they were exposed? They were American servicemen working on American base in Kuwait, and yet they were not protected.
And you just think about Dubai airport. Like, so many people I know fly through Dubai on the way to their holidays, and that's now sort of, it's not a war zone, but it's a very vulnerable bit of the world now.
Yeah, someone, a very senior official in the Gulf, said to me today that what Iran, in trying to increase the price, it's gone after sort of the headline buzzwords like Dubai. Everyone around the world knows what Dubai means. Go and Dubai as much as possible. And so Dubai, which has up until now been synonymous with stability, safe haven, place to get rich, place for the rich, the playground. Now suddenly there's images, and they're just the small ones, but still 5-star, 6-star hotels on fire, debris falling into swimming pools, and of course Strait of Hormuz. And so all these words, buzzwords, if you like, of places that matter to the world are what they are hitting.
Right, Chris, we've got a question.
Which Iran says are legitimate targets, of course. But
yes. And also some people would say Dubai is not a playground because the human rights for some of the people that live in Dubai aren't very good.
Yeah.
But that's a whole other issue. Chris, question for you from
But the
Jimmy.
hotels are not deliberately being targeted, I should just clarify.
Yes.
It's intercepts and missiles.
Oh, yeah, and that's the other thing. There's sort of there's a lot of fog of war here.
Yeah, a lot.
Because you initially see reports and you think, oh, Iran has struck that building in that country.
No.
And actually, often it's a
And in
drone being
Dubai, the
intercepted.
Fairmont Hotel, which has become emblematic because the palm is emblematic of what Lisa's talking about, the playground. that wasn't hit by a missile. That there was a drone that was intercepted and debris came down, and obviously a hotel's full of glitzy bits and bobs. It just went up in flames, and a lot of people took pictures of that, and it went wild on social media. But it wasn't actually hit by a missile.
And I suppose that's the very basic observation about wars, is that they then have consequences, and it's difficult to predict the consequences, and it becomes confusing, and there are spillover effects. Right, Chris, as promised, a question now for you from Jimmy, who says, is Keir Starmer playing a blinder by showing strength, which is something Trump actually admires? Which is a slightly counterintuitive question from Jimmy there, considering lots of the commentary around Keir Starmer.
So Keir Starmer's outlook, and he gave this news conference on Thursday afternoon, I think trying to, certainly from a UK perspective, seize the agenda and look like he's taking a grip of the UK response, because he's faced pressure from Donald Trump, he's faced criticism from some voices in Cyprus, where there's the RAF base, and indeed domestic pressure from various angles around the UK's response. I think there is something perhaps, and this is more Lyse and Jane's wheelhouse than it is mine, in terms of Donald Trump respecting those who do stand up for themselves. That said, from the Prime Minister's perspective, it is also true that he's had, I think, quite a lot of pressure from Washington. We've seen it publicly. I think it's been happening privately as well, particularly regarding access to runways, both in Gloucestershire and in Diego Garcia. I think the Prime Minister, I certainly got the impression at the news conference this afternoon, he used the phrase, he talked about being calm-headed, that sort of sense that this is a conflict without, there's so many unanswered questions.
Well, yeah, his opening line was, I'm here to show you how calm I am, and that's my leadership. And I do just wonder if you have to sort of say that explicitly. It sort of suggests you're maybe feeling a little bit subconscious.
Yes, I think
self-conscious.
I think that's a fair kind of critique or observation. I think he was trying to, certainly to a UK audience, give across a sense that he sort of knows what he's doing, and he's approaching, as I say, with that kind of calm-headed sense. I think there's a sense in government they know where public opinion is at the moment. It's certainly the early evidence of public opinion in the UK, which has long been sceptical about Donald Trump, full stop, but then I think is about this war as well. And I think as well, a sense from him of almost a sort of new reckoning around the whole quote-unquote special relationship. Because, so much, we talked about this, didn't we, earlier in the week on Newscast. Obviously, he has invested a huge amount of effort into building a decent relationship with Donald Trump. We've seen repeatedly now Donald Trump in the last couple of days be pretty critical.
Well, yeah, let's remind people about what happened in the Oval Office at the start of the week when the German Chancellor was visiting. Donald Trump was doing one of his Q&As with the press, and he was asked about the attitude of Britain to the military action in Iran. And this is what he said.
By the way, I'm not happy with the UK either. That island that you read about, the lease, okay, he made it, for whatever reason, he made a lease of the island. Somebody came and took it away from him. And it's taken 3-4 days for us to work out where we can land there. It would have been much more convenient landing there as opposed to flying many extra hours. So we are very surprised. This is not Winston Churchill that we're dealing with.
So that's a reference he's making there to the Chagos Islands. And we've talked, haven't we, on Newscast about this long-running argument about the future of the Chagos Islands, and in particular the military base on Diego Garcia, and the argument that you've heard from the British government, given that there's been something of a row about the future of the Chagos Islands, is the way to secure the long-term future of the base, even though it comes with a price tag, is to hand over the sovereignty to Mauritius, but then to lease back the base, and that offers, so the British government argues, is the long-term future of this base, which
for
is
100 years.
Yeah, which is hugely important to the UK and indeed to America. I think Donald Trump has rather conflated the arguments around the future of the base with arguments around the Prime Minister not giving him permission in the first instance to use the military base there to from American bombers targeting Iran. That permission has now been granted, we think, for both the base there and indeed RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire, for these defensive strikes on missile sites in Iran. But clearly a frustration there. You've heard from the president that not only was this a disagreement with Keir Starmer, but it was a disagreement from the White House's perspective with consequence, because they couldn't use those runways, and that was that was inconvenient because they had to use other runways with additional flying hours, etc., etc.
I don't know what newscaster Jimmy's film tastes are, but I wonder if he's getting at the Love Actually reference by when he says, is Keir Starmer playing a blinder by showing strength? In other words, like in the film, when Hugh Grant's the Prime Minister and Billy Bob Thornton is the President, and Hugh Grant basically says to Billy Bob Thornton very publicly, you ain't having I'm not giving you what you want. I can't remember what the actual policy issue is in that film.
My goodness.
Is this an example, though, of Keir Starmer
Is Keir Starmer like Hugh Grant, or is he like...
I mean...
Well, I think, look, I thought there was an interesting riff from the Prime Minister at Prime Minister's Questions this week, where he tried to publicly redefine or define in his own mind publicly what he sees the special relationship to be. So he was saying, in terms, it's not about hanging on every word of President Trump. And that's pretty much what he said, I think, not hanging on every word of President Trump, but it is about intelligence sharing. And by the way, when I speak to folk who are in the sort of deeper elements of the relationship, if you like, between London and Washington, they emphasise that military and intelligence and security services cooperation, which is really deep-seated. And then the political relationship sort of ebbs and flows depending on who's in the White House and who's in Downing Street, etc., etc. But talking about intelligence sharing, talking about the military cooperation going on in terms of protecting allies in the Gulf, etc., as opposed to, if you like, the more rhetorical stuff between the two leaders. But then I suppose that's what you are going to say when it's been a bit bumpy.
But the relationship hasn't been perfect in the past.
No,
there have been good relations. Think of George Bush and Tony Blair. There have been less good relations. Obviously, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan also strong. But you don't have to go that far back.
Vietnam,
Britain refusing to send troops to Vietnam, and what happened there. So I think you're right. There's a sort of public level, which is a relationship between usually two men, maybe a woman occasionally, Mrs. Thatcher, and then the reality, which is the much deeper and broader understanding and cooperation on defence and intelligence.
But one of the interesting things about this conflict is just how everyone is trying to project their version of strength and trying to do it very visually. So, for example, Pete Hegseth, the defence secretary in Washington, the Secretary of State for War, as he calls himself, published that video, which appears to show an American submarine shooting an Iranian naval vessel off the coast of Sri Lanka. Just another example of the ripples spreading out very, very wide from this conflict, because Sri Lanka's a very long way away from Iran. And then he was sort of going on this whole thing of this quite yeehaw thing of this is the first time the Americans have sunk a ship with a torpedo since World War II. And then you've got Emmanuel Macron doing that speech about France's policy on nuclear weapons in front of a huge nuclear submarine in a dry dock. And then he's sending the French aircraft carrier to the Eastern Mediterranean. Meanwhile, Keir Starmer is talking about sending HMS Dragon. And it's going to take about 2 weeks for HMS Dragon to get to Cyprus. So all this sort of supposed strength or whatever, it being deployed very visually.
Yes, but then the twist with the whole question around HMS Dragon, with the Prime Minister getting some criticism for how long it's going to take to get to the Mediterranean, probably a couple of weeks because it hasn't set off yet, is my understanding is it was due to be heading to the High North. And of course...
last month's crisis.
Well, this is the point, isn't it? What were we talking about just a matter of a couple of weeks ago in the context of Greenland and that last flare-up between President Trump and other Western leaders around all of those questions. So, my goodness. And then on the question of Donald Trump and his relationship with others, not least Keir Starmer, I'm struck... And Lyse, this is intriguing, isn't it, with this president? And then we were examining, weren't we, the history of the special relationship over decades. The relationship between Donald Trump and notionally his allies can ebb and flow in matters of days and weeks, can't it? You just think around the rhetoric around President Zelensky, for instance, and how that's ebbed and flowed.
Yeah, he might tomorrow call up and say how much he, loves the king, loves the accent of Sir Keir Starmer. You just don't know from
and the king, of course,
and by the way, in one way, he is like Churchill, because Churchill really flattered Roosevelt as well and tried to send him thousands of messages and really made it. Of course, Churchill came up with the phrase "special relationship."
8 years ago this week.
Yeah.
Is it? Okay.
It is. Yeah.
Listeners of Newscast, the podcast will know.
Yeah.
But just on that line, I find it really interesting because you've also had Mark Carney, who has basically saying, "Well, okay, we have we are backing it with with regret, and then hasten to say, but we see this as that it isn't consistent with international law. So you have Sir Keir Starmer, the barrister, and Mark Carney, the banker, trying to make sense of Trump, the property dealer. And it's like, what if a banker, a barrister, and a property dealer walked into a bar? What kind of war would they have? But they're really, and I will say this in Sir Keir Starmer's defense, the legality of it mattered, because what does the UN Charter say? That you can only take this kind of action, invade another country, attack another country, is if you have a UN Security Council resolution or if there is an imminent threat. And there is neither still in this war, and it's about to enter its second week.
And obviously everyone will remember what happened with Iraq.
Yes,
and
the shadow is there.
That
Which
shadow
Keir
is
Starmer
there.
refers to explicitly.
Yes,
and of
exactly.
course, the efforts that were gone to ensure a UN Security Council resolution, and the questions over the legality and would the advice be made public, and it was all very, very difficult. And nobody is forgetting that. And as you say, especially Keir
And they
Starmer.
shouldn't.
They shouldn't, no.
Right, well, we've done a sterling job of getting through a whole 2 questions. A lot of brainstorming going on here. Right, a question from Simon in Aberdeenshire. Oh, this is a good one, because this gets deep into actually how Iran works as a country. And Simon says, what is the status of the regular Iranian army, not the IRGC, not the Revolutionary Guards Corps? And is the domestic Iranian army enough to depose the weakened regime or protect citizens from a clampdown? In other words, quite often if you had a coup, it would be driven by the army, they'd be replacing their leaders, and they'd step in to sort of look after the people. But of course, in Iran, you've also got these elite Revolutionary Guards as well.
Ideological.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So-
Well, the regular army is actually big. It's about 400,000 strong, but it is a regular army, and its task is to secure the territorial integrity of Iran, both internally and externally. And, if there's an external threat. But that's a big army. And the IRGC, which is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, is exactly what it says. It was created in the aftermath of the Islamic Revolution in 1979, specifically to guard the tenets or the beliefs of the Islamic Revolution and to guard the supreme leader. And it's a much smaller force. It's about 125,000. So it's, a third to a quarter of the size of the regular army. But it has the power, because not only is it the power, together with the besieged militia that Lyse mentioned, the paramilitaries that essentially go with it, it controls the sort of sharp end of the defence system, the Navy, the missile brigades, the whole nuclear program. These all come under the IRGC. It has the real strength, and it also has tentacles deep into the country, into its economy, into its industry, into its politics. So it is the real force in Iran, and not the conventional army.
And Jane and I had a great conversation on Wednesday's episode of Newscast, which you can listen to if you scan the QR code on your screen right now, where we were quizzing our colleague Siavash Ardalan from BBC Persian. And he was talking about how there's a theory and some evidence that the Khamenei regime told the IRGC to be quite decentralized and sort of just gave them some broad instructions about if there was an attack from the Americans, here's what you should do in principle, but it's up to you, individual units, individual regions of the country, to fight back in the way that works for you, which kind of makes it harder for the US to dismantle.
But also the foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, admitted this because he was interviewed and was made a kind of an apology to Oman, which had come under attack. But Oman has been the main mediator between Iran and the United States for decades. You could see his expression. He said, well, it's decentralized now. In effect, he was hinting that someone took the decision to hit Oman, not realizing how crucial Oman was to the Islamic Republic.
Does Iran have any friends now? Because a lot of those countries that it's been attacking were sort of getting into the friend zone in the last few years, weren't they?
There was a huge rapprochement that these, major Sunni Arab states, including the wealthy Gulf monarchies and the Islamic Republic of Iran, had come to a kind of a rapprochement, realizing that, to use a phrase that's sometimes used, regional solutions, regional problems need regional solutions. And during, for example, the 12-day war last year, it was absolutely crucial that Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister, could pick up the telephone and talk to countries in Arab capitals. And in the run-up to this war, they were on the phone constantly to President Trump or racing to Washington to tell him, don't go to war because it will have huge consequences. But again, today, a very senior Gulf official said to me, it will take decades to repair this lack of trust. And in fact, they said to me that if and when the negotiations ever resume, Iran had been refusing to put ballistic missiles on it. There's no way now that the United States, Israel, or these Gulf states, Arab states who've come under attack are going to allow Iran not to include ballistic missiles. They now see it as a threat.
How much of a risk is there now of total chaos in Iran?
Very high, I think, very high. Because, as Lyse said, it's decentralized. The order went out. You control your own regions. There's some 30 provinces. There's some 12 ethnic groups.
And a huge country.
And a huge country. So the possibility of a fracture and the possibility of a failed state is, I think, growing potentially more risky. And, of course, a failed state means what the Americans have been talking about in the last few days, which is the threat of terror. And what will come out of Iran, what might crop up in other countries, obviously also criminal elements, and the outflow of refugees. And when you think about a huge country like Iran, how many thousands of refugees could flow out and into Europe and create a crisis? The stakes are really, really high that Iran disintegrates in some way.
Ooh la la.
No.
I know. But this is what's causing such unease and torment for Iranis, even those who want to change. Iran is a very proud people, very nationalistic. And the integrity of Iran really matters. And we don't have time to go into this, but the reports, conflicting reports about either United States or Israel arming the Kurds is sending shockwaves among Iranians who don't want it to break up on ethnic lines, as you said. But it all depends, Chris, on how long it goes on. So far, the centre is holding. So far.
Was that a bit of French Canadian popping out there?
What?
When you said ooh la la?
Did I say ooh la la?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you said it in a very French way, but also a little bit Canadian
What
way.
have I done wrong?
Yeah. But just to,
I saw you flinch.
but just to end on a serious note, though, and actually, Jane, I was just thinking that when you said, "Oh, there could be a huge refugee crisis," I hadn't even thought about that. And I think it's because we've got colleagues who are on Iran's borders looking to see for people crossing. And they've all been reporting that it's a trickle of people
Because
crossing.
the centre is holding, as Lyse
yes.
says. At the moment, it's holding. But
And so psychologically, it feels like, oh, there isn't a huge wave of refugees fleeing yet.
But it's only week
Exactly.
it's only week one, and then we're back to what is the time frame for this? And I don't think we obviously heard President Trump saying 4 to 5 weeks at one point, and then he said we're ahead of schedule. So what does that mean? Does that mean a few more days? But wars. I mean, Putin was going to take Kiev in a week.
Yeah.
Obviously, it was all going to be over, and it's months later, and they're years later.
Years
in the
later,
case,
yeah.
4 years later, and you just think people start out with these time frames.
God help all of us if it's still going on.
Right. That's all for what should we call this? What did I come up with the acronym today? CAST stands for Current Assessment of the Situation Today. Because we were doing
What's our situation
we were doing
now?
a program earlier on, me and Jane, with lots of military acronyms. So I came up with my own acronym, which
I
is
like that. What was it again?
Current Assessment of the Situation Today. Newscast.
Or what we normally call news.
You could call it that. Yes, that's
News,
right.
news.
So
Let's
that's
stick with-
what we're doing.
Let's stick with the old name, the news. Right. Jane, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Lyse, thank you.
Always a pleasure.
And Chris, good to catch up.
Thank you, Adam.